So I'm one of the assistant directors here of the EPIC Center, Energy Production Infrastructure Center. Our executive director, Mike Mazzola, couldn't be here today, so sort of presenting some of the work that we're doing and talking a little bit about grid modernization resilience. What is that? Department of Energy defines grid resilience like so. We define a couple of different sort of dimensions, I guess, to it. Basically making a grid that is more resilient, more reliable, more secure, more affordable, more flexible, and more sustainable. All right, so along those dimensions. Now, one thing I'll talk about a little bit here today is that reliability and resiliency are not the same thing, and people tend to sort of interchange those two things. We think a lot today about resiliency, reliability, when really it's different than resiliency. So we need to think about those things a little bit differently. So I wanted to give just a little bit of a discussion, I guess, about what's going on currently in the state of North Carolina, just a little bit of a backdrop. Many of you, all of you, I don't know, might be familiar with the Power Forward Carolinas program, which was a grid modernization effort that Duke Energy tried to roll out. I guess officially announced it in 2017, and then in 2018 it was not approved ultimately by the Public Utilities Commission. So I wanted to talk a little bit about it. Okay, and not advance my slides. I think if I move that, it advances them. Okay, so what was the Power Forward program, and why did it fail? So it was an attempt by Duke to look at grid modernization, and there's essentially, I just took straight from their program what they talked about. Basically putting in things that a lot of people don't necessarily think of as grid modernization. They think of things that really should just be happening anyway. Advanced metering infrastructure, communications network upgrades, distribution hardening and resiliency, which is really a matter of replacing cables and things of that nature. Basically updating their back-end system, self-optimizing grids, so being able for grids to recover from different situations, targeted undergrounding, and then updates to the transmission system. The plan was basically to spend $13 billion over the course of 10 years. And just to give a sense of that, I mean, so down here, this is from Duke's filing in South Carolina, just to show some of the impacts from Hurricane Matthew. What you see here is, so for instance, in that last column there, percent of outages eliminated, right? So essentially what they're saying, Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas, you're seeing something on the order of about a 30% reduction in outages. That's effectively what the type of metrics they were looking at when they tried to pitch the program. If you're familiar with it, what you'll know is there was a number of issues that were raised by different groups throughout the state as they went through the review of that. One of the first ones was that people did not like the fact that there was really minimal oversight. There was minimal oversight by the Utility Commission after the first year, essentially giving Duke a sort of a streamlined process for annual increases. Ultimately, this was going to be paid through by a rider program, was what they were looking at. And the plan really didn't include much of a cost-benefit analysis to really look at whether the measures Duke was proposing were going to be more or less cost-effective than things like energy efficiency, demand response, et cetera. And that was part of the issue as well. Ultimately, before the program was declined, Duke actually went into a settlement with a number of environmental groups and others and reduced that to a $2.5 billion pilot, which was a little bit more inclusive in terms of what it was looking at. So I listed them here. So some of those same things, hardening of wires in hurricane-prone areas, voltage optimization, but I look at these last two pieces here, which I'll talk a little bit more about in my presentation here, but a better infrastructure for electric vehicle charging. Some of this was talked about in Steve's presentation earlier. And then energy storage deployments in North Carolina, so adding some of that. And there's not a great case for energy storage in North Carolina right now. We heard about that a little bit earlier. Ultimately, however, this compromise plan was rejected by the Utility Commission. And I've got a line here, you get the slides later, but straight from the order from the Utilities Commission, Duke failed to show exceptional circumstances exist to justify the establishment of the grid rider. Effectively, what they did is they said they felt like they lacked the statutory authority to be able to approve a rider for these grid modernization efforts. So that was a bit of an issue. There were a number of issues associated with it. I don't necessarily either support it or I won't say anything about it particularly in terms of the policies itself, but the fact that they felt that they lacked the statutory authority was a little bit problematic. I wanted to take a bit of time and just talk a little bit about the difference between reliability and resiliency, because some of the reason why people did not like the Power Forward program is because a lot of it is viewed as reliability and not resiliency. So reliability focuses upon normal operation of the grid. So grid disruptions during normal times, things like vegetation management problems, trees falling on lines, landscaping, squirrels, those sorts of things, very normal things. And there's good metrics that exist around those things today. So I have two of them up here, SAFE and SAIDI. Basically what they look at is what's the average duration of an outage, how frequent are outages. There's a number of metrics, they're well established, regulatory bodies look at those all the time. When it comes to resiliency, however, resiliency doesn't focus on operation during normal times. Resiliency focuses on operation after things have really gotten bad, right? So after what we tend to call high impact, low frequency events like hurricanes or heavy winter storms. Resiliency definitions, there's a quote here I have, they're not formal enough to be used as regulatory terms of art. Right? In other words, resiliency is something people are still struggling with exactly how to define it. And until those can be well defined, it's a little bit challenging to think about how those particular things can be thought of from a regulatory perspective. Okay. And so there's a number of studies out there, DOE, national academies have talked about the fact that we need to focus on this question. What is resiliency? And how do we value it to be able to use it from a regulatory perspective? And so I included this graphic here. Again, this is from Duke's regulatory filing. Again, really looking at reliability things, not resiliency things. And that's a little bit of an issue that one comes in to play with. So a couple of things, I guess, when it comes to developing a modern grid in North Carolina, what's happening today? What are some of the things that are going on? So here, this photograph here, I have an example of essentially a solar plus energy storage project in North Carolina down in Brunswick EMC, where you have 12 megawatt hours of storage that has been added to the system. In terms of where we sit, so North Carolina, obviously, as we've talked about, it's the second largest installed solar capacity base in the nation, and 90% of that is third-party owned. As we talked about, though, earlier, a lot of that is not fully utilized because we don't have the ability to store a lot of that energy. The recent energy storage study found relatively limited value for solar in North Carolina, even by 2030, which is an important point. Today, I wanted to look, I guess, in general, if you look at storage as a resource or storage as a tool, the two most cost-effective reasons nationally for utilizing energy storage today. The first one is demand charge reduction in areas with high demand charges. McKinsey, Green Tech Media, a number of others have done studies that basically show about $15 per kilowatt is kind of the break-even point at which it becomes worthwhile to have behind-the-meter energy storage. We're not there in terms of demand charges. And then in markets where there's a viable, areas where there's a viable market for grid services from batteries, and we're not there either, right? Now, resiliency, however, can change that. There's been a number of studies that have looked at if you begin to value storage from a resiliency perspective, then the value of storage can significantly change. An example, Puerto Rico after Maria. This is an epidemic of broken generators and diesel supply issues, right? Getting diesel around after a storm is a problem. If you have PV plus energy storage, that can potentially change that, however, if you have the regulatory means to be able to deal with it. But the question is, to be able to get to that point, we have to look at how communities and businesses value the resiliency benefits of storage, right? So like I said, NREL has done some initial work on this, and that's a question that really is not out there in terms of the regulatory space right now. North Carolina has led the development of PV for two reasons, in terms of utility scale PV at least. Favorable implementation of PURPA and favorable REP standard. The key thing, though, that we saw this in the energy storage study, is that third-party asset owners currently don't have any incentive really for energy storage in North Carolina. That's something that needs to be dealt with. This is an area that we're kind of working with right now at UNCC. We actually tried to partner with a number of the third-party asset owners in North Carolina to go after a large DOE activity, because we think that this is an area that needs to be tapped. How do we address some of both the technical policy concerns in this area? I wanted to give a couple of examples, and there's a lot going on in the slide. You guys will get this afterwards, but I want to tell two quick stories, I guess, about some potential examples of the issues and need for resiliency and types of things that are happening in North Carolina. This particular example, this photograph here is from, I think it's McGuire Nuclear Station near Charlotte, where essentially back in November of 2017, there was a fire at the substation here. This is the substation leaving the plant. There was a fire at that substation, and effectively, so there's two transformers here, an X and a Y. Basically, I think Y caught on fire or X caught on fire, but the fire spread to Y. Bottom line is transformers are a very expensive piece of equipment. They're not easy to get. There's not many critical spares that are out there. As a result of that, essentially it took from November of 17 to June of 18 to basically get those transformers replaced. One of the big concerns that came into play at this particular point in time, at McGuire Nuclear Station, there is an intertie between the 230 kV and the 500 kV lines in North Carolina. On the 230 kV network, there was a lot of concern because as coal plants have been retired, there's a lot less generation on the 230 kV network than there used to be. And the Duke operations people in early November of 17 basically looked at this and said, we have concerns about whether or not if we can get this fixed, and if we have a high winter peak or a high summer peak, we may have to load shed throughout Charlotte if we can't deal with this issue. And the reason here effectively was because there was so little generation on the 230 kV network, they were already pulling quite a bit off the 500 kV network. Those issues around resiliency, those are the sorts of things that need to be thought about in terms of these kinds of issues about what is happening to the network right now as we make the changes that we are making to the network. Those need to be thought through very carefully. As it turns out, of course, that didn't become an issue. The peaks were not as high, and they were able to deal with getting the critical back in place as quickly as possible. Another example, which I think is an interesting one, so this is Hot Springs, North Carolina, a town of about 600 customers or so, where effectively you have one single high voltage line going through rugged terrain. And in this particular case, this is where we're looking at putting in a microgrid, which is the right thing to do in that particular environment. So you can look at more of the details on here, but concerns is that it may or may not actually may not be feasible to put in that microgrid in this particular case, for two reasons down here: regulatory approval, being able to get that through the Public Utilities Commission, but also the economics, whether or not it's economic. We don't really have a good way of being able to put that through at the moment. So a couple of things, I guess, in terms of the current issues and where we see some of this going. The number of weather-related disasters and inflation-adjusted dollars is there at the bottom. We all know this. The number of weather-related disasters is going up. The way we look at this, resiliency does not fall neatly into the current regulatory process. IRP processes don't really take into account that. And you're seeing people think about things like IRP 2.0, for instance. How do we look at the IRP process and think about resiliency? The way that we're looking at this, or beginning to look at this, we think something needs to be thought through very carefully. The cost to society after weather-related damages can be, in this case, from the Congressional Research Service, $25 to $70 billion a couple of years ago. The cost to a utility to recover is much less than that. The example I give here is Katrina was $1 billion. We think that there is a missing link here, which is the relationship between grid modernization and the resulting economic and social value of the avoided lost economic output and societal impact is significant. So we heard earlier about someone with their power down for 5 days. There's a cost economically to society after these major storms that somehow needs to be taken into account in the regulatory environment. So to quickly wrap up, the key piece that we see is a need to address modernization efforts as an insurance policy, that top point there, an insurance policy for society overall, rather than in the traditional lens of utility cost recovery measures, because that's sort of a critical point. And resiliency metrics need to consider the value of these various investments in some way, the grid hardening piece and how microgrids, for instance, can be used for those hard to reach customers or critical infrastructure. And then a couple of final points that we look at that we think is important. Looking at the examples of other states at keeping nuclear in the mix because of what it can do potentially. Incentivizing the independent developers to include PV plus energy storage. We have a lot of opportunity for that in North Carolina. That's something we need to think about. And then this concern potentially about the Utility Commission not being able to authorize those grid modernization riders, that's potentially something that needs to be thought through as well. So with that, thank you.
Thanks, Robert. And now we'll hear from Jeffrey Petrusa of RTI.
Let's see. I just forward through.
Yeah, just you want to use the arrow.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, thanks. I guess I'm the last presenter for today, so bear with me. I'll try to be short. I also, in full disclosure, has to do this kind of last minute. I feel like I had a commitment this weekend, so I was typing this in the car as I was driving back from Charleston. My apologies for typos or anything else. But what was asked of me was to kind of give an economic perspective. I am, I guess, a little bit of background. RTI is kind of a non-for-profit in the area. We do a variety of energy and climate change related economics through my own shop, which is the Center of, I guess, Center for Environmental Technology and Energy Economics is our official title. And I've been around for about 15 years doing a variety of different studies in this space. This project is really to summarize what we've done for NCSEA on the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard and its economic impact on North Carolina. Which is kind of morphed. I think originally in 2012 when we started this project, we were really focused on what the impacts of the energy policy was on the state. We've now moved to an era where we were kind of meeting all of our targets in the reps, and we're also looking at the ending of some of the tax credits. And so it's really about tracking continued investment in renewable energy and understanding its own kind of cumulative economic impacts over time. So then that's kind of the history behind it. And I guess RTI performs this our role in this project is to provide some independent kind of analysis that gives some estimate of what the economic impacts are, and I'll get into some details about that. So this is a retrospective economic analysis that we've done, again, annually. We kind of revisit it. But now the most recent publication, which came out in 2017, looked at the cumulative impacts across 2007 through 2016. As of February, we actually started an update that will incorporate 2017 and 2018 investment as well. But the goal is to really understand or analyze the consumer, utility, and government spending changes that have occurred as a result of renewable energy adoption in the state, and then approximate the direct and indirect economic impacts from development over that time period. So these are really summarization of the findings from our 2017 report, but total economic impact that we assessed on the most recent publication was roughly around $20 billion. This is associated primarily with $10 billion in direct investment associated with renewable energy kind of capacity installations, and also there's an element of this that's energy efficiency investments as well. And in return for that investment, the state has offered some tax credits or incentives, and that the payout as of 2017 or 2016 was around $610 million in incentives claimed. There are more credits generated that are waiting to be claimed, and I assume we'll report those in the most recent upcoming report that's due out this spring. And then the total employment impacts are also listed, 126,000 or so FTE equivalents. I want to be careful for people who may not be familiar with economic analyses. this isn't ongoing number of jobs. This is an equivalent of a count of the number of full employment of a single person for a single year. So if you think about this over the years of the time frame that we're looking at, you could think of possibly simplification would be an average of this number over the number of years of the analysis, which puts us at about something less than that. But I don't want to overemphasize the jobs impacts without giving you those caveats. So just a quick summary of our methodology. We do a lot of data collection. Fortunately, North Carolina is special in the sense that there's a lot of requirements for public reporting, especially with the renewable energy tax credit requirements. So for the earlier years of our study, we relied heavily on the North Carolina Renewable Energy Tracking System, NC-RETS. We also get information from NC Green Power and some other entities, and then heavily rely on the IRPs and the other utility commission dockets, which I expressed earlier. I have frustrations with searching through, but it's always fun to get in there. So we once we have collected kind of information on the level of capacity installed over time, and kind of this is, again, we're doing annual updates, so building on a larger data set that we've accumulated over time. We have some estimate of what the total capacity installed is and what that investment has meant in terms of some base year dollars. We plug that into InPlan, which is a standardized input-output model for analyzing the economic impacts of any kind of spending change. This is a pretty widely accepted method. And this is at a state level, I should say. And then the resulting changes are assessed in terms of direct, indirect, and induced economic impacts. And I can maybe offer some explanations about that, but in the interest of time, I'll move forward. And so this is just a graph summarizing what those investments have been on an annual basis. So again, we're looking at it from a cumulative perspective, but this is incrementally showing you how North Carolina investment has risen over time. And then we're also showing what the state payout has been in incentives kind of next to that. I think it gives it's pretty direct. I don't know, for me, it's visually pretty compelling to see how greatly differentiated the state incentives have been to the level of investment over time. And the orange at the top is the energy efficiency investments from the utilities and demand side management programs. This is a pretty informed crowd, but this is the distribution that we came up with as a result. Obviously, solar is by far the key energy, renewable energy source. We did have wind emerge in our last publication, and it was largely the result of a single project out in northeastern North Carolina, but it did finally make it onto our charts. And then there's just a contribution of other groups. Biomass, landfill gas are kind of the other dominating sources, and then much smaller contributions from these other technologies. And then this is always my favorite map. I get to draw a map, and again, this is a little bit of caveat to it. This is filtering on our data set to only look at investments that are of $1 million or greater. So I don't know, keep that in mind. But spatially, how distributed this energy, renewable energy impact has been, I think is really interesting. I don't have a lot of great stories for why we see counties without a whole lot of investment or any investment. But again, this is for large-scale investment, so there's also residential investment that isn't presented here. But the solar's distribution across the state is pretty impressive. I guess the wind project that I mentioned from Amazon Wind Farm is up there. The biomass is interesting. I think a lot of it is indicative of some co-firing that's happening at some larger existing facilities, but I thought this was an interesting figure to present today. Okay. Just going a little bit into detail on the energy efficiency spending. The split is utility savings initiative makes up about 1/4 of the total investment, and then demand side management is 3/4 of the total investment there, for a total of about $1.2 billion is what we were tracking. Again, these are cumulative numbers, 2007 through 2016. And then this is kind of our key slide for the total economic impact. So total output is kind of the revenue received to all firms and individuals associated with the expenditure that we were tracking. There's renewable, and it's broken down by the energy efficiency alternative programs, initiatives, and the renewable energy projects. And it also contributes to roughly a little bit more than half of that goes to cumulative gross contribution to the state economy, so GSP. And then I guess folks had asked me to talk a little bit about employment impacts. Again, I don't want to read too much into what we generate because it's a multiplier effect of the in-plan model itself, but the kind of net total effect on employment is about 126,000 FTEs, and the breakdown again by energy efficiency initiatives versus renewables. So this includes both direct employment for the energy-related industries as well as any kind of secondary or supply chain related industries and supporting hospitality, other industries that would come up around some increased activity or spending in the renewable energy sector. We also have tried to, in the interest of kind of having a balanced look at the analysis, we've tried to account for the changes in spending that are associated with redirecting investment from what would have been spent on either conventional energy programs to focus more on energy efficiency opportunities, or also the change in government spending associated with the state incentives offered to adopt increases in adoption in renewable energy consumption capacity, sorry. And so just showing that there's some net change in employment where we're actually picking up a little bit of a loss due to the redirecting of spending, but the employment effects are still pretty strong. And I guess I wanted to say something about this, leave you with something more than just kind of here are the numbers. And so I put together just a few thoughts of my own. And again, I don't want to take a policy slant. I try to just remain objective in our analysis. But the things that I think about when I see those large numbers are kind of these elements. Like what's the mix in terms of professional skill level requirements? Are we talking about 126,000 FTE equivalents of low skilled labor, or is it some combination? What does that combination look like? And then also for me, going back to that spatial distribution map, where is that employment occurring? Is it happening co-located with the investment, or is it more concentrated around the state? And then if it's important as a community to think about equity or distribution of that employment impact, what are the policy options and incentives you can develop or offer to improve upon the employment impacts? And then the other question was, what labor pools are we pulling from? You know, some of this is coming from the existing energy sector industry, already fully employed people that are just being asked to do more or change, kind of expand their job requirements. But we also have some shifts from employed workers leaving specific industries and entering into the renewable energy sector, but we also have some unemployment as well, that we're bringing on people from an unemployed sector. So understanding what those labor pools are, what their contributions are to these employment effects is also of interest to me. Yeah, and then just understanding how relationships in terms of output and employment are changing over time. So if we're investing, for example, in energy efficiency opportunities, are we reducing the required level of labor required to generate a single unit of output, or how is that changing over time? I think is important. And going back to the in-plan analysis, one of the shortfalls of it is a relatively static matrices of how different outputs rely on a series of inputs. So as we move through time, there is some degree of dynamics that's not being captured in what we're analyzing today. And then I think there's also this question of in-state versus out-of-state employment and the degree to which we rely on some of these impacts occurring outside the state versus inside the state. RTI makes no claim to understand how that trade-off is made or what the distribution is. I think there's other folks and other publications in the state that do a relatively decent job of taking a look at that and taking a stab at what those might be. So that's it for me, I think.
Now we have a few minutes for some questions for these speakers. We have a couple over here.
The proposed rider for the grid upgrades, how is that going to be charged to the customer? Was it just going to be a fixed percentage on everyone? What I'm getting at is what are the equity issues on that if you just raise everybody's electric rates to upgrade the grid?
It's a good question. So I don't know all of those details of how that was structured in terms of that aspect of it. I was familiar with what technically was going on with it, but I don't know those specifics. I don't know if there's anybody in the room that does. There may be some folks that do.
Anyone in the room want to take that?
Yeah, just briefly. And there's actually a new proposal coming now.
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
So which has gone on, and they tried to get it in South Carolina. So far it hasn't gotten into legislation, but they're trying on the Senate side, and they're asking for rate stabilization here. So at least the South Carolina language that they're pursuing legislatively is very, very broad. So it could apply to all kinds of things. It's kind of a blank check.
Right.
And they're seeking 3 to 5 years with an opportunity to re-up. So the challenge there, of course, is how do you hold anybody accountable for that period?
Right.
I had a question too, but I don't want to take away from the person who asked.
It's a grid modernization question as well. Dave Rogers with the Sierra Club. In terms of the policy changes or regulatory changes you mentioned, I noticed that 2 of them seem to advantage the utility, and the third one advantages developers. So subsidizing nuclear facilities, a rider, and then solar, and figuring out a way to incentivize storage. I'd just be interested in what customer ways or ideas you might have in order to make sure that this doesn't just lead to a bunch of expenditures that aren't necessary. That's obviously the concern of a couple of those things. Either what's happening in the other states or in your kind of research of like opportunities to make sure that the customers actually benefit from all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so those were a couple of things that we noted that I wanted to bring out, like particularly the PV plus energy storage was one that I wanted to bring out. I do think that, some of the things that you hear out there, the performance-based rate making, et cetera, are obviously things that need to be thought about from the customer's perspective, which really isn't too much on the table yet here. The other element that we're looking at from, I guess it's an element of a research perspective at the moment, but this question about the value of resiliency, which I think has an extreme value to the customer, and sort of after these storm events and such. And that is not something that has really come along just yet. But that's something that a number of people are looking at, including ourselves. And I think that's a big challenge. There's been some interesting work out of NREL looking at this, and if you look at something like Maria, what it would have done to have PV plus energy storage located throughout the island rather than a bunch of diesel going around, it can have a huge impact if those questions are addressed.
Thank you. A few more questions, maybe some new voices, if that's okay.
Ann Lazaridis, NC Warren volunteer. This is towards the economic side. Is anybody trying to do a systematic economic analysis of the benefits foregone when data is not made readily available? Consider data that's available in this state, for example, relative to data available in other states, or in Europe, for example. So that data availability triggers certain economic activity and certain actions. And I'm just wondering if anybody's actually analyzing that so it can be part of the public record and available for decision-making about transparency.
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't speak to people assessing. There definitely, it sounds like a wonderful study to assess what those economic impacts might be of the lack of reporting requirements. I can say, just to give you an example, in California, well, there are folks in California that are working on some machine learning based, I guess, spatial, satellite mapping, kind of using big data to assess what the capacity installments are, for example, in photovoltaic. And primarily it's being driven by the fact that in some states where you don't have reporting requirements, it's be really hard to do the study that we're doing in North Carolina. And so it's kind of one of the neat ideas that if they can do it right and do it well, which I can't speak to today, it would alleviate a lot of the burden around trying to cultivate that information in a state that doesn't have those reporting requirements. But yeah, no, I can speak to the value of having those reports available to me to conduct this study on an annual basis, the IRPs, the Utility Commission data, NC-RETs for a long time, although now that the tax credits have been removed, I think the incentive to report in the NC-RETs database has maybe been diminished. We're definitely picking up more projects through other means than what were traditionally the mainstream data sets for quantifying capacity install. So, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So, could you give me an example?
So the people who are interested in installing solar and storage in appropriate places relative to the strengths and weaknesses of the grid, but that data is not readily available here, even though it is in some other places. So there are benefits foregone because of that. And it would seem helpful when making policy decisions to have those benefits foregone be quantified. So if somebody were to think about what type of data might be made available that isn't, and then look systematically at what the benefits of that would be, it would make for a concrete argument on behalf of transparency.
I would agree with that. But I, again, don't control the purse strings. I guess, yes, it would be incredibly valuable.
Maybe one more. Do we have another question?
Thanks for bringing up one of these issues with the IRP is its inability to register certain values. And I would offer that if we're going to be considering how to update that process, IRP 2.0, that we also go ahead and include the value of mitigating climate change, which is the choice of fuels as opposed to the type of grid issue in the IRP process. So something for us to consider as we're thinking of how to do this clean energy plan is to have the governor speak to that huge opportunity. And I continue to raise these issues given the small window that scientists say we have of 10 years and kind of the urgency, and I'm very frustrated by the incremental mindset that so many of us are caught up in, myself included.
But I just one thing to say on that. I mean, I think that the IRP 2.0 piece was the other thing in response to the other question. I mean, just generally speaking, and it actually gets back, I think, to what you asked about the data. If we want to begin to think about this sort of resiliency as an element of IRP, we need to have access to that kind of data to know about what are those weak points in the grid where PV plus energy storage is valuable, et cetera. So it's all related to IRP. There's a number of things that need to be thought of in that process for sure.